Hello, this is another one of my videos on Parker's short history I should say, to the Second World War. This one is the final chapter, the impact of war, casualties, crisis and change. As the chapter is quite long, I've subdivided it up into sections and separate videos. This is the first section on war deaths. In advance, let me apologize for any sound you hear from road noise. Normally I try to make these videos at the weekend when there's less traffic, but we had a major power cut at the weekend, so now I'm recording this on a weekday. Referring to World War II as a whole, Parker opines that no other years have transformed the lives and expectations of millions of men so drastically as World War II. The effects of the war extended far beyond the battlefields. The military machines of the great powers moved men and women away from their homes, some for good. In organizing materials and men for war, states might inflict hardships and death, or bestow regards and opportunities. In certain countries, racial prejudice applied by armed and ferocious police shifted or destroyed entire communities. As well as physical violence, economic requirements changed relationships between nations, societies, and individuals across the world. For many, the war brought ruin, but to others it brought emancipation and hope. To some it brought the profound satisfactions of cooperative endeavors, but to others the loneliness of fear and the self-absorption of misery. The struggle in Eastern Europe accounted for most of the war deaths. Soviet sources give the number of Soviet citizens killed as 20 million, with another 8 to 9 million servicemen and women, including 2 million prisoners of war who died in German captivity. But these figures could well have been higher if we include premature death from hunger and exposure among those deported to Germany or sent off eastwards within the Soviet Union or made homeless by military or punitive action. The Soviet census for 1959 showed a deficit of about 50 million people compared with the predictable projection from the 1939 figures under stable circumstances. But this would have included births which never occurred, either because of separation or the loss of men on the battlefield. Among the 20 to 24 year age group, only 6 men survived for every 10 women. Both military and civilian deaths were predominantly male, although the civilians also included many women and children. The death rate in Soviet labor camps was higher, probably even higher, amongst those in forced labor for the Germans. In addition to the great battles, the Germans deliberately destroyed many people's homes. In the German-occupied areas, over half of all dwellings were either damaged or destroyed. When Soviet guerrilla bands attacked German supply lines, the Germans responded with savage repression. Villages suspected of harboring any hostile elements were routinely destroyed, and at least the entire adult male population was shot. Many civilians became volunteer helpers to the Germans, commonly employed in German uniforms as Osttruppen, static troops employed against the Allied invaders to the west. We now turn to Poland. German police and occupation troops seeking to keep order in Poland, as also in Yugoslavia, resorted to unrestrained, intimidatory murder and slow death by overwork, both inside and outside of the organized concentration camps. It is impossible to enumerate Polish losses with any confidence. Post-war borders were radically different from those of 1939, and both the German and the Soviet authorities deported large numbers of Poles. The official Polish figure of those killed is 6 million citizens of the pre-war Polish state, including about 3 million Jews. Military battle deaths were about 150,000, with many more deaths amongst those deported west into Germany or east into the Soviet Union, or those who were concentrated in the Nazi general government, the Polish rump statelet, where they were treated as expendable slave labor. Others died from hunger or by shooting, a common fate for intellectuals, priests, and the upper and middle class leaders of society. By the Soviets as class enemies, by the Germans as opponents of the dominance of the so-called master race. Both sought to destroy any Polish spirit of independence. Acts of resistance, notably the Warsaw Uprising, together with German and Soviet bombing, led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, whilst hunger allowed diseases to take hold and increased mortality rates in every age group. Poland was fought over twice, first as the Germans advanced east, and then as the Soviets drove them back. The German occupation was brutal, bringing famine, slave labor, and murder. These brutalities being justified by the Nazi doctrine that Poles only had the right to live for the benefit of Germans. This oppression lasted longer than in any other country. Figures for German war losses vary considerably, from 4 million dead, including 500 civilians and 125,000 Jews, to over 7 million, including 3,200,000 civilians. If we're only looking at the 1937 borders of Germany, then the lower figures are more accurate, although they may underestimate loss of life amongst Germans who fled or were driven from the formerly German areas taken by Poland in 1945. The casualties amongst the Volksdeutschen, those of German language and culture, who had lived outside of the 1937 borders, often for hundreds of years, can't be determined accurately. Some post-war German figures seem to maximize their losses, perhaps to emphasize the real sufferings of many East European Germans, especially those expelled from post-war Poland and Czechoslovakia, as the Nazi policies of deportation and resettlement were now applied to ethnic Germans. Large numbers of those who had striven to get onto the list of Volksdeutschen under the German occupation now cast off their label as quickly as they could, as the Germans withdrew, and they should not be counted amongst the dead. In Greece and Yugoslavia, resistance movements had attacked the German occupiers, who had responded with their customary brutality. Their basic tariff being to kill 50 locals for every German lost to the so-called terrorists or bandits. In some areas, rival local groups had also fought against each other, as with the resistance struggling with the Axis-sponsored Croatian regime, the Ustashi. All told, about 1.5 million Yugoslavs died during the war, most of them civilians. In Greece, 20,000 soldiers and about 140,000 civilians, including 60,000 Jews, were killed, in addition to an estimated 140,000 people who died from famine. The figures for Hungary, Romania, and Czechoslovakia are uncertain, apart from the Jewish victims, 550,000, 120,000, and 140,000, respectively, because of the changing frontiers, but losses were about 200,000 to 300,000 in each country, and in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, most of those were civilians. Bulgaria suffered less, with about 10,000 military dead, 11,000 Jews, and relatively few non-Jewish civilians. Neither Norway nor Denmark suffered from Nazi racial hostility, but the Norwegians suffered about 10,000 killed, and the Danes far fewer than that. Finland lost about 80,000 people in its wars with the Soviet Union, almost all of them in the military. In the West, the German occupiers behaved with comparative correctness and inflicted far less death and destruction than in their eastern living space. In France, military deaths were about 250,000 and civilian deaths between 300 and 400,000, including individuals killed in air raids or as victims of German reprisals or in deportation to concentration camps or forced labor in Germany. Belgium suffered over 10,000 military deaths and about 50,000 civilians. In the Netherlands, the Dutch administration remained in working order throughout the war and maintained accurate and detailed records. Their military losses, including combat against the Japanese as well as against the Germans, came to 7,900, but an additional 3,700 were killed fighting for the Germans, mostly in combat units of the Waffen-SS, for which the Germans recruited enthusiastically amongst those deemed to be of Aryan stock in order to help defend the new Europe against the Bolsheviks. Of civilian deaths, over 5,000 died as forced laborers in Germany, out of over 300,000 who were there by the end of the war, some in Allied bombing raids, others through illness and hard working conditions. Nearly 3,000 people, mostly men, but also a few women, were executed by the Germans in Holland, usually in reprisal shootings after attacks on German officials. 20,000 also died as a result of military operations, and an estimated 16,000 starved to death as a result of famine towards the end of the war. Added to the Dutch Jews who were murdered, over 150,000 civilians perished. Australia, with a similar population size to the Netherlands, lost about 19,000 military dead, half each in the wars against Germany and Japan. Italy, intensely fought over and bitterly divided by internal struggles, lost about 400,000 people, half each military and civilian. In Asia, Chinese losses were too uncertain to even allow an estimate to be suggested. Wikipedia, I should note, gives a wide range of estimates, including ones as high as 20 and 35 million military and civilian deaths combined for the whole of China in its conflict, which predates World War II with Japan. Japanese losses from 1941 to 1945 are more certain. These include 1,740,000 military deaths, only 1/3 of whom died in combat, most through hunger and disease, about 300 civilians and soldiers, which includes those who surrendered to many of those who surrendered to the Soviets in 1945 and were never seen again, and 300,000 civilians in the home islands, presumably mostly as a result of air raids. As to the British Empire and the United States, Britain lost 264,000 military and 90,000 civilians, 2/3 of the civilians through bombing. In the British Empire, Canada lost 35,000 people, Australia 19,000, New Zealand 11,000, South Africa 8,000, the colonies 20,000, and India 32,000 military, and as well as millions more in the famine of 1943, exacerbated by the diversion of shipping for Allied needs elsewhere. The Americans lost about 300,000 military, as well as 5,000 civilians. In general, total populations soon recovered. After the disruptions and separations of war, there were longings for domesticity, marriage and parenthood. Marriages and birth rates increased dramatically after the war, but not in the Soviet Union or Germany, where the shortage of both men and food checked any post-war baby boom. As in the Soviet Union, amongst 20 to 40-year-old Germans, there were in the post-war period about 6 men for every 10 women. One benign consequence of World War II, which should be mentioned also here, was the availability of penicillin and its derivatives. First discovered in 1928, it was only in 1940 that Howard Florey and Ernst Chain in Oxford were able to isolate the purified compound, but it was still only available in tiny amounts. By 1943, however, methods of mass production were being developed, making it more readily available, and by 1944 it began to be made available in civilian hospitals, as well as for Allied troops in the Normandy invasion. It saved the lives of many men wounded in the fighting, as well as curing most venereal diseases, a major problem amongst the well-paid American troops. In passing, we note that German troops were better disciplined and had access to military-supervised brothels, so suffered from this problem less. Together with advances in nutrition and general prosperity, this chemotherapeutic revolution in the treatment of infections greatly reduced post-war death rates. So many thanks to you for listening, and particular thanks to my patrons for their kind support and encouragement, without which I wouldn't be able to make these videos. You're very welcome to support my channel if you wish. Like, comment and share on the videos. Subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos. It really is helpful. Patreon and PayPal links I'll give below in case you want to provide practical support. Next week we'll talk about resistance in Eastern Europe and the Balkans. So have a good day.